Good morning. Nice to see everybody here again. So it seems that the first day was a successful, interesting day, and that make you come back. And I think that we also have a very interesting agenda for the day. So this is going to be our second day for RSD 8. For those who are coming for the first time or the first day today, I'm Carlos Teixeira. I'm a faculty member here at the Institute of Design. I'm also the coordinator of the PhD program, and together with Peter Jones and Aaron Tekogu. Where is Aaron? Here, great. We are the co-chairs of the RSD 8. So we're going to move straight into our program today. And I just want to highlight that how the day will unfold. We're going to stay the whole day here in this building. So we don't need to move out. Of course, you're more than free to explore the campus and go around. In case you don't know, if you cross the building over there, the McCormick Center, you have a convenience store, and that you might want to get something by your own. But we're going to have lunch over here, and we're going to have a reception at the end of the day. So everything's going to be here in this building. Also, if you haven't had the time yet to go around in the building and learn and see more of our school, feel free to go around and see where the students are working, classes are happening. Just keep in mind that we are in full session for our semester. So students are here, classes are going over, and we are having a routine day just with the double population that we usually have, given that we are hosting you guys. And then tomorrow, just anticipating when we finish today, when you come back tomorrow, we're going to start also here. And also tomorrow is going to be the whole day here. So no need for anyone to go out of this building. Something that I would highlight in case you want to go for a walk outside of this building for the day, get fresh air. There is the Crown Hall building, which is a masterpiece from Mies van der Rohe. So it's one of those modern landmarks, and it's exactly here in this campus. So I highly recommend that you go around, and just a few blocks from here. So if you get out, go to your right, you're going to get into the Crown Hall. It looks, all those buildings look a little bit similar, but the Crown Hall is the masterpiece that was the major reference that created all the other buildings in this campus. So, and it's considered a masterpiece around the world from Mies van der Rohe. So good opportunity for you to go there and check that building when you want to go for a walk. So in terms of our program today, we're going to have 4 speakers. So we concentrated all the keynote speakers today. And our intention is to have more of a dialogue. And the idea that 4 people in a row with a moderator allows us to have this exchange of ideas. Instead of just spreading out all the speakers throughout the conference, we thought that it's better that we concentrate them and establish this dialogue through those keynote speakers. So we really handpicked them, and we're going to have Chris Rudd, we're going to have Saskia Sassin, Terry Ewing, and Charles Bezerra. We're going to have a tribute for Charles Owen that Charles Bezerra is going to be doing that tribute. And then we have the reception, and then we close the day. Who is going to be facilitating and managing that is going to be Larry Keeley. So I want to give a quick introduction about Larry, and he's going to take over for the day. He's going to be the one that's going to be moderating, meaning doing all the introductions, as well as kind of putting some reflection in between those presentations. As I said, we want to have more of a dialogue, and Larry will be the one that will kind of connecting a lot of dots throughout those presentations. So, Larry, please let me introduce you. Larry is the president and co-founder of Dublin Group. Business Week named Larry one of the 27 most influential designers in the world and one of 7 innovation gurus changing the field. He has, he has worked with the world's largest companies to build their signature innovation competencies. His book, 10 Types of Innovation, codifies much of the research in tradecraft that drives effective innovation. So that's the more formal introduction. I had always the pleasure to have class with Larry when I was doing my PhD here, and we always interacted since then. I also had the opportunity to have Larry when I was teaching at Parsons, coming and giving feedback to the work that students were doing there, always with great impact everywhere that he goes. So nothing keeps unchanged wherever Larry goes. So that's my... And I always have the pleasure of interacting, and I think we are very fortunate to have Larry here at one of the adjunct faculty in our school and one of the board members that has supported ID throughout this journey. So now I'm going to let Larry take over. I'm going to just sit on the back and enjoy the day. And I hope that you also have a very provocative day with all the lectures and all the discussions. So welcome, Larry.
So, of course, what Dr. Teixeira was far too gracious to acknowledge was that the other co-founder of Dublin was Jay Doblin, who knew what he was doing 4 decades ago when we began this search for substance. Look, our whole purpose over yesterday, today, and tomorrow is to try to foster a different and deeper, more humble and courageous understanding of systems as they intersect with the field of design. I'm thrilled to be here for our day filled with keynote addresses that are supposed to help us to advance our thinking broadly in the field. But as a warm-up exercise, I would like to just acknowledge a panel of light switches 4 feet behind my back and 15 feet to my left, your right, as a way of illustrating the challenge that I think we all face. You turn on any of those light switches, does anybody know what happens? I mean, really? What happens? Let me explain a little bit of it. 40 miles from here, a power plant is generating power. Like most human beings, you have absolutely no way of knowing just automatically what kind of power you're using. So in this zip code, the power that you're using is 50% coal, 30% nuclear, 15% natural gas, and despite the lonesome little, wind mill a block from here, less than 5% anything sustainable. So when we convince ourselves that we're being responsible by getting electric vehicles and do it in this zip code, we're basically creating an incredible number of unsustainable activities in the environment that we're using. It's just ridiculous. Now, the way I knew that is because I borrowed an app conveniently funded by the US Department of Energy back when we had Democrats in charge. So you can plug in any zip code in the United States and determine what its energy source is. That's called Power Profiler, a fairly cool little capability. So that's how you know the first step, how do we generate the power? Then it has to go through a step-up transformer, and it has to go through a transmission line where an awful lot of energy is lost. It has to go to a step-down transformer to a substation that would be somewhere on this campus. It then has to come to this building through a series of rectifiers and go to a power panel that uses circuit breakers so that that switch can have, power to it. And when you flip the switch, it excites a little tiny little thing in those fluorescent lights up there that excites the rare gas in the tubes and allows them to glow with light. That's how it works. Now here's the deal that was explained to me the first time I ever came to ID 4 decades ago. Nobody thinks in systems. 5% of the world's population are capable of thinking in systems, and yet everything that we're building all around us these days is utterly dependent on systems. And so our deal is that we have to figure out the intersection of design and systems in a way that we can actually have a fighting chance of getting regular Joes and Josephines to understand the world they're living in, the water they're swimming in. And that's always hard. And what's the reasonable role of designers? The reasonable role of designers is to try to make sure that even though people have the attention span of squirrels on meth and a colossal incuriosity about anything important, we actually humanize it enough so they can get it. And they can get it in a way that is accurate. And they can experience it and understand it and possibly even make it their own in some basic way, so that we become people that are better informed about the world we live in, agents of change. And to a very large extent, while we've ceded for many decades the creation of systems to engineers and to politicians and to people passing laws, it's almost certainly the case that the frontiers of systems will all be those that are humanized again by designers willing and able to think about these problems at the level of complexity that is actually real. So it's my pleasure to be acting as your sort of master of ceremonies, your host, to welcome and to introduce the great speakers we have to throw some light on this complicated topic. What I know for a fact is that thinking in systems is now essential. It's vital, but it's hard, and it's rare, and it needs humanization. We're going to begin, fortunately, with Chris Rudd, who's thinking about how to do that in terms of communities. And communities are one of the places where systems are all around us. They're mostly dysfunctional, and awful lots of things fall through the cracks. Let me tell you a little story about a neighborhood that's about 4 miles from here called Greater Grand Crossing. In that neighborhood, 50 years ago, there were pretty good grade schools. And a young student in those grade schools, is a fan of the Institute of Design and a long-term friend. He was the co-founder of Land's End, the catalog that you know about. And in finding it, Gary Comer grew up in Greater Grand Crossing and loved his little neighborhood, but he moved to Wisconsin to create the Land's End Company. He created the Land's End Company originally because he was a sailor and loved being on sailboats and hated shopping. So the whole idea of Land's End originally was just to provide sailors with the world's best sailing gear. And then he discovered that that wasn't really a very big market. There were like 7 guys interested in it. And so he started providing nice sweaters that would be a pleasure to wear when you're on a cold lake or ocean. And those started to sell pretty well. And over the years, he discovered more and more things until Land's End was a multi-billion-dollar brand. Anyway, the guy gets old and rich and decides to visit his old neighborhood in Greater Grand Crossing one day and discovers that the place is a complete blight, that there are 95 different abandoned homes which have been taken over by drug dealers mostly, and that the school budgets have been raided and the students are frequently from broken homes and from social, situations that are highly dysfunctional. So he visits his old school and he says, well, what do you folks need? And they needed everything, basically, but one of the things that he noticed is that they didn't have any computers. He says, do you need some computers? Oh, that would be great. So he leaves. Next thing you know, there's a semi-trailer load of computers brought to this little grade school, and all a gift of Gary Comer. And so 6 weeks later, he's happened to be in Chicago again. He stops by and says, how you doing? And says, oh my goodness, those computers were so grateful. Let us show you the room where we locked them all up. And so they take him on a tour, and he opened this big kind of room, and there's all the computers, and he stares at them for a moment and says, people sometimes discover that computers are more useful if you take them out of the box. And they said, yeah, but we don't really have that internet thing. And he said, okay. So he leaves, and the next thing you know, there's a team of IT people from the Land's End organization that show up for 2 days to build the internet inside of the entire school system in the greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. And so he leaves, he comes back, and now they've got computers and they're actually using them, and you know, it's a brave and beautiful new world. And he says, well, what's going on, really? And they say, well, you know, our kids are just in trouble all the time, especially after school. They're usually from a single-parent family. They have to do something to try to manage their lives. It's just a breakdown. It's a mess. And he says, okay. So he thinks about that for a few weeks, and then he funds a very famous institution, which you should visit if you get a chance, called the Gary Comer Youth Center. Inside of the Gary Comer Youth Center, every kid of any age is granted a quarter of an acre to learn how to do organic farming if they want to. There's a full-time media lab. There's a full-time exercise facility. He was clever enough to invite all of the police officers in that neighborhood to come there for free and to work out and exercise. There's a midnight basketball place for the kids that are in high school. There's a free clinic on site so the kids can get all their vaccinations and they can find out if that earache they've got is actually something that needs antibiotics or it's viral. He's got an amazing, you know, introduction there to robotics. It's the beloved place where all the kids come after school every day. They've got little magic bands that allow them to come in automatically. They can learn how to do daily news broadcasts from a news studio that he funded in the place. And, you know, it was like incredible. And it's benchmarked all over the world as a sort of integrated after-school, you know, community environment. So then he said, well, now what's up? And the next thing they told him is that the teachers couldn't afford, you know, their lives. So he bought all those 95 houses. He raised 40 of them and created parks. And the others, he built nice, affordable new houses and gave them to the teachers. This keeps going. It's kind of a long, shaggy dog story. The next thing he built was a high school called Gary Comer College Prep with a ridiculous mission, a mission to make sure that the kids not only graduate from high school, but they survive and succeed through 4 years of college. No high school in the country has a mission like this, except Gary Comer College Prep, to my knowledge. Among the things that they discovered systematically is that the way these kids get trouble in their first year in college is that they are often the first kid in their extended family to get to go to college. So they miss a deadline for filing for financial aid, or they underestimate the kind of pressures they're going to be under during midterms or finals week. And they have meltdowns. And the kids would often have no support network like they did in the Gary Comer universe, right? So what did they do about that? They went to T-Mobile and convinced T-Mobile to get fully paid smartphones for all of the graduates of Gary Comer Prep through all 4 years of high school, so everybody always had a way to phone a friend whenever they were in trouble. People that would respond and figure out how to get things to happen. Now here's the problem that Chris Rudd is going to teach us about. Not every neighborhood has a billionaire that adopts it and just systematically fixes the problems. And so we have this really interesting little challenge of trying to get a system like Gary Comer was capable of thinking up to happen in a world that classically and chronically underestimates social challenges, underfunds them, and deals with the fallout after the fact of failures rather than the preventative medicine that we can learn about when we see systems thinking at its best. Chris is an amazing guy. He was a fellow at the D.school, as you know from your little introduction to our speakers. He's also, we're very lucky to have him here as one of our professors in ID's own design lab. I'm eager to hear what he's going to teach us about how we deal with communities and challenge and change. And this is one of the most important places where systems thinking needs to get traction to humanize a world where we're increasingly aware of the cost of dysfunction, but not enough aware of the nature of the systems challenges we actually have to rise above. So Chris, will you come up and regale us with songs and snappy patter?
So you got a sneak preview of one of the slides. Thank you for having me. This is exciting and an honor. I don't necessarily consider myself a systems designer, but I think the work that we do, particularly in communities, can lead to drastic systems change. And that is a good approach to trying to do this work, especially on the social level. I really want to start with, or talk about two projects that I've been involved in that are really situated in the American context in black neighborhoods. So what I want to talk about is not necessarily about systems change in every community, in every country, but with a very specific focus around systems change in black communities, and particularly in Chicago. And so my approach has always been, how do we empower those who are closest to the problem to then be agents to solve those problems? So we'll talk about two stories. The hypothesis for this talk is, if we're aiming to redesign systems of governance, then we have to deal with the legacy of slavery and racism, again, in the American context in Chicago, when particularly dealing with black communities. I'm sure this would also be applicable in other countries around the world, because colonialism has touched every nation and their populations who've had to deal with that, and typically are left out of conversations, left out of decision-making processes to change those systems in which they live in. In America, we have now just reached our 400th anniversary of the institution of slavery. 1619 was the year that the first ship landed in Virginia with enslaved Africans. So we have a long history of perfecting this system of exclusion, oppression, exploitation. I want to show a quick video of what this has looked like. So I know it might be a little difficult, but there are dots that leave Africa and arrive in different parts of the Americas, and each one of those dots represents a slave ship. It gets worse. So if we think about the transport of this many humans from one area to another, there's a huge complex system that has to be created to control that type of humanity. Look at most of these dots. A lot of them go to Brazil. I think in the slave trade, 10 million Africans went to Brazil, about 1 million came to the United States. So we're still, and millions more died before they got here, right? But to now control 11 million people creates you need a complex system of laws, behaviors, norms, and politics. And so the United States created these norms, but for who? And so when this country was started, it wasn't I don't believe it was around white supremacy, because before those slave ships got here, they were white indentured servants on the Mayflower. So it wasn't about uplifting the white race. That also didn't even exist as a term. That concept of white was not created yet. So when this country was started, and when those ships started to arrive, the people who had power, who could make decisions, who could shape this nation, were white men 21 and older who owned land, mainly because they could vote, and they were the ones who then owned property, aka other humans, enslaved Africans. And so a major technology that they created to sustain this system, to allow it to function, was race. And so I don't believe that race was created by designers, but it is a design thing. It has changed over time. It has adapted to suit the needs of a system that had to separate folks. So just a quick history. When indentured white servants were in the United States, and when Africans were brought to the United States, they were originally indentured servants. They weren't slaves. They weren't slaves forever. And so those two groups intermarried, they worked together, they loved each other, they played, they did all these things, they lived in communities together. And so then when you oppress people, they don't like it, and then they fight back. That's kind of a natural outcome of that system. And so they did. And once those rebellions started to happen, they had to create a new thing to ensure that the system survived, the system of slavery survived. So the concept of race, in which we know now, was started to develop in this country. And so it's been this major form of, for me, governance, because it dictates in a lot of ways how, especially black people in this country, maneuver and live out daily lives. Just recently, a woman was killed in her home playing a video game with her nephew by the police. And so race became this construct of control in this system. And so to now carry out this new system, you had to have an authority to then make sure that these things, these laws, these norms were abided by. And so at this time, they started slave patrols. And these patrols were state-sponsored individuals who then had the power to police black bodies mainly. They did more than that, but that was their primary function. So if a enslaved person ran away, their job was to capture them, bring them back to the plantation, and get them back to work. Race also created this, again, back to these rebellions, they had to separate these two. So this concept of race, they started to say, okay, there's a white group and there's a black group. You all are not the same. And so these patrols helped to ensure that ideology was enforced in physical form in the public. And so you start to create this norm of second-class people. So you have white owners, and then they evolved into just anyone who was not black was then a citizen, and they could have these rights to function and govern themselves in the system. And then you had black who did not have that ability. So you start to create these norms and unspoken rules in an American context of how people should act, but then also how can or can they not participate in the decision-making process around their life. And so this thing around policing goes into the stories for later. The outcomes, some of the outcomes of this were, for black Americans, are fear, distrust, and hierarchy. I think you can ask any black American, well, 90%, how they feel when police are around. There's a innate sense of distrust. There's a fear, thinking back to the story of this young woman who was killed in her home, committed no crime. The neighbor called the police because they weren't sure how she was doing. They were doing a checkup, and a checkup call turned into a murder. And we've seen these videos a lot over the past 10 years. this hierarchy where we look at participation in civic life is drastically lower in black communities because there's a healthy distrust of not just the police, but the system largely. Do we have the same rights? We see voter disenfranchisement, we see gerrymandering to ensure these new systems, or ensure that the system maintains this hierarchy. An output for these practices are huge incarceration rates in this country. I believe we incarcerate 25% of the world's prison population, even though we account for less than 15. And this shows the progression of that. One of the key features in around 1970, they started the war on drugs, which was an attempt to rid America of drug use and make sure that we got everything right. But the output was what I like to say, racist mass incarceration. So we have a prison population in this country of 2 million. 1 million of those folks are black. This also is reflected in our juvenile justice system. So here in Chicago, the city of Chicago exists in the county of Cook. For those who are not from America and don't know that piece, it's confusing. And so in Cook County, we have a juvenile detention center, which is a juvenile jail. And I started doing work with young people, teenagers who were formerly incarcerated, to figure out how do we reform that system. And this was in partnership with the county government. The president of the county board said, we have a very racist judicial system in Cook County, and we need to figure out how to fix it. And so a voice that is typically not tapped to understand systems or change systems are young people. Through many different mechanisms. They can't vote. There's perceptions that they don't know anything, right? There's adultism, so there's all these things that keep them out of the process. And so she said, why don't we bring them in and see what we can create? In Cook County at that time, 88% of the inmates in the juvenile jail were black, 11% were Latino, and less than 1% were white. Even though the demographics of the county are drastically different. It's 60% white, like 15% black, 15% Latino. So even with these crazy disparities exist, she tells a story that a delegation from South Africa came to visit the jail, and they did a tour, and when they were done, they said, okay, can you take us to the white jail now? And she said, we don't have a white jail. And that was the spark for her that this is drastically messed up. So the work that I started doing was with a group of 25 young people, and we started this thing called the Juvenile Justice Council. And again, the task of the teens was to figure out how to reform the justice system. Now, if we know systems, they are very big, they're very complex, and you can't just tackle them. Lots of times you have to understand the complexity of the system, but then you have to go at certain pieces to then try to make change. So we started to focus on reducing recidivism. And recidivism is the process of exiting incarceration and then going back. So that is a huge part of the justice system in this country. People exit, they don't have services or things that they need to stay out, and so then they reoffend and go back. And so we looked at how do you disrupt that process. At the time, doing our research, we found out that 25,000 young people in Chicago were arrested, which meant they got these rap sheets. And these rap sheets really hinder your ability to progress in life. So when I was in school, they would always call it your permanent record. So this is like the actual permanent record. And so if you had contact with law enforcement, if you were arrested, you would get this rap sheet, and then it would affect your ability to get work, it would affect your ability to go to college, sometimes it would affect your ability to live in a house. So lots of low-income families, lots of low-income children who get state-sponsored housing, so they would get a voucher to live in a unit. It's through the Chicago Housing Authority. But one of the rules is no one in the unit can have a record. So if a young person receives one, say they got into a fist fight at school, got arrested, now they have an assault. If the housing authority found out about it, the parent would then have to make a choice to either kick the child out or move out of the residence because they couldn't keep their living quarters. So these seemingly small infractions had large repercussions. But there is this process called expungement where you can erase your record. And so at the time, there were 70 expungement applications in the city and 70 applications granted. So 100% success rate, but we're talking about 70 out of 25,000. Excuse me. So the young people that I was working with said, well, we can do better. We can create a solution to this. And so we weren't intending to try to solve the entire system. We just thought we would provide a service to help their peers. So they created an app that allowed young people to find out if they had a record and then get connected to a pro bono lawyer, a free lawyer, to then carry out this process for them. It got a lot of attention, a lot of use, and so city government started to take notice, and so then they started to promote policies for automatic expungement for young people. And so we ended up getting 3 law changes around juvenile expungement. So now it's automatic for young people. There's certain things that just don't go on your record. And instead of you having a file, sometimes it just automatically gets erased. So that's one instance of working with those most affected, empowering with these tools to understand the entire system, and then really having confidence in them to create a solution that matters. The second story that I want to talk about is a project that we just completed here at ID this past summer called 51 Futures. And so Justin, who I think checked most of you in, Yu Ching, Matt, and our dean, Dennis Weil, and myself, we were all part of this project to create a community design studio in Bronzeville, a community on the south side, to empower residents through design to create new futures for their own community. So we set up a living lab in this marketplace, which is in the picture. And so it's this place called Boxville, and they retrofit shipping containers to have a marketplace, a temporary marketplace for black entrepreneurs to get their foot in the door. This community, which is also where IIT sits, is a historically black community. So when the Great Migration happened from the south to the north, black Americans were forced into a very condensed area, Bronzeville being one of them. And so it became a black metropolis. That's the term that they would use. Now it's been adversely affected by a lot of complex decisions, overexploitation, and racism. So now the average income in this community is $27,000 a year. And so this market was set up to try to regenerate black economies, black businesses. And so we thought, what if we brought a design studio to this neighborhood? Could we be of service to help these residents think about the future of their community? And so it was a very interesting project. We were not doing research. We were not trying to understand what they want. We wanted to just be helpful, which I think is something that design can and should do. So we started off saying, we want you to design, we want to help you design the future of your neighborhood, but we have no idea what that looks like for you. So we just created a statement saying the future of blank has to be different than the past. So encouraging folks to think of new futures that have real consequence, not just do we need a new basketball court or do we need a new playground, right? A lot of things that philanthropy in our city has imposed in a lot of these neighborhoods. And so one of the things that really came forward was the future of black folks. So when we asked the statement, the future of what has to be different, someone said perception of black folks. And people asked, what does this mean? And so he just started to explain to his fellow residents that this meant that people have to look at us different. And the thing that he was talking about was racism. That the overlying thing that has kept Black Americans down and from not being able to fully participate in these systems is racism. And that if we can change that, then we can start to change the entire system, education, healthcare, whatever smaller systems you want to think about, to actually incorporate us and allow us to be in the decision-making process, to shape what they look like. And so we started to think about that and asked people to think about that from different perspectives. We asked them to think about it from a policy perspective, from a technology perspective, and then we started to ask them to think about it from the market perspective. So to go into the future and look back and think about how did that marketplace improve the perception of Black folks. And so if we can embed this value, this outcome that the community wants into the design of new things, what would those things look like? And so one of the outcomes that they came up with was changing the marketplace into a campus for Black fashion. And so thinking about circular economy principles, how could you provide all the services that a Black fashion designer or a Black seamster would need to successfully run their business. One of the outcomes that all the market owners said was they would have the ability to hire. We know unemployment rates in America amongst Black folks are the highest of any group. And so if we allowed these Black business owners to then hire Black people, could that be a real impact on employment, which then could potentially be an impact on health, education, housing. So, excuse me. So the project ended with presenting these recommendations to the owner of the market. We also created a new infrastructure to try to encourage civic participation in the community using modular boxes that could then be used as platforms for people to host events, that could then be transformed into a totem pole to advertise events, but thinking about new civic infrastructures that improve the perception of Black folks. So basically, if we can start to think about race, racism, these historical oppressions, can we now start to think about new ways, new governance structures, new governance systems? And so I just want to end with that. I think it is the responsibility of designers to address these historic oppressions into our work of systems change. That if we're not doing that, we're not democratizing the process, we're not addressing the overlying issues that have created the actual scenarios and circumstances in which we find ourselves. And through that, we can empower non-designers to be agents in that change. Thanks. That's it.
So, Chris, before we open it up to questions and comments from everybody, I want to make a couple of observations and push you a little bit in some of the fabulous work that you did. I wasn't familiar with the neighborhood innovations that you guys did, so it was a pleasure for me to see that. As you know, one of the sort of soft and diffuse topics that is peppering its way through the current pre-game show for next year's election is the idea of reparations. Do you have a point of view about that? Do you have some sense of the economic effects that would happen? Do you have any thoughts about what we could do to build a case for that or a case against that if it's not a good idea?
I mean, I'm for it because I think we should get something for doing all this work. So I'm not going to turn it down. But I don't think it's the solution. I think the way markets work, the way economics work. If we infuse that amount of money into a group, there will be a new tool to extrapolate that. As long as we're not getting at racism. So a lot of times we use this term under-resourced or underprivileged communities when we talk about black and brown neighborhoods in the United States. I think that's the wrong analysis of it. I like to say they are overly exploited communities. So it's not that they don't have things. There have been targeted interventions or policies to extrapolate from those communities. So we look at the housing market. They just released a report. Black homeowners, their houses were devalued at $83 billion over the past 80, 90 years. In Chicago alone, it's $4 billion. So that's capital that could have been used for schools, housing, right, all these other things. So if we're not addressing those things, even if you give black people reparations, whatever that would look like, if we're thinking just monetarily, no, I don't think it would be sufficient.
So what's so great about Chris's answer is he's already showing you how complicated a system would be, that the answer isn't just more resources, the answer is to try to figure out the way in which those resources are depleted and the structural ways in which a system continues to put obstacles in the pathway of progress. There are many, many, many emergent ideas that people are modeling, especially with behavioral finance principles. So one of the interesting ideas is a guaranteed minimum income. For the first time in the history of our species, to a very large extent, people the world over are actually afraid of the future. And they have a broad sense that there may not be enough jobs for people to be able to have a halfway decent income. And I think that that's opening up opportunity spaces for interesting new ways to think about opportunity engines. It's clear to me that the work that you are doing is trying to figure out bits and pieces of the opportunity engine specifically for the population that has been systematically denied opportunities. So I really appreciate that. One of the things that is helpful, I think, is to at least learn about little places in the world where these kinds of advances are occurring. Historically, the idea after the U.S. Civil War was to grant freed slaves, you remember this phrase, 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule. The idea was you've suddenly been freed, but you have no form of income. So in places across the nation, but specifically in the plain states where there are a lot of undeveloped lands, the idea was to give a freed person 40 acres and a mule so they would have a start. To your exact point, Chris, very often either the acres or the mule got stolen shortly thereafter, but the idea was to think through that transition stage, right? And so sometimes people do, in fact, try to have thought-provoking policies. In Ghana, there's a little capability that I've spent a lot of time studying called Ben-Ben. All through sub-Saharan Africa, and this is also true in India and in Brazil and in lots of other developing nations, there are slums that might have 1 million, 1.5 million people living in them, right? And one of the things that's really remarkable is that the capability pioneered in Ghana is called Ben-Ben, which allows someone kind of squatting in a slum with maybe 15 square feet of property to use precision GPS systems to get a deed issued for the land that they're squatting on. Suddenly, the family has an asset for the first time, and that asset can then be used to go get a loan for creating, let's say, for instance, similar to your idea, a business for a seamstress in the family, you know, a sewing machine and an iron and a few other things. And it's because of the existence of GPS and the ability, I don't know if you know this or not, but GPS systems are precise for the United States government and our Defense Department, but not precise for you and me. They were able to figure out how to make them precise enough in Africa to be able to grant these very, you know, sort of accurate deeds, wiping out, among other companies, Chicago Title and Trust, and let's hear it for that. So it's an example of a mechanism, and my guess is with your work, Chris, we'll have to discover 40 or 50 such mechanisms in order to be able to have a system robust enough so that it not only has its heart in the right place in the first place, but it in fact manages the cascade of consequences downstream. This is one of the most interesting principles of modern innovation, that modern innovation is really about the elegant integration of well-known things, much less than the primary invention of truly new things. And so I celebrate and acknowledge the way Chris is trying to think it through with all of the complexity intact. One of my favorite phrases I like to inflict on my students is that the dumbest way to simplify something is to throw out all the hard parts. Okay? So as we learn to think about this comprehensively, Chris, my hope is that we'll try to find the 30, 40, or 50 simultaneous integrated interventions that might in fact be robust enough to really usher in a new era of progress and decency. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make about any of that? While we're talking about systems, I'm sure you've all discovered by now that your body is a complicated system. Among the things that your body has is something called ischial tuberosities. These are the portions of your tiny hiney that get compressed when you're sitting in a dysfunctional seat. And what happens is it stops the blood flow through much of your lower extremities, and it makes you incredibly miserable. And of course, this being a great design school, we have maximized our chance to inflict misery on your ischial tuberosities. And for those of you down here in the front, we've also tried to make sure that you're blinded by the sun, which was, thoroughly anticipated in this lecture hall environment provided for us recently by a very thoughtful architect. So I just want to acknowledge the misery we're inflicting upon you. Part of the way we're trying to get you to think about systems thinking is to make sure you understand that systems thinking is roughly the modern equivalent of the Bataan Death March. So if you're not prepared to endure some misery, you're really not cut out for this field, okay? So that said, before we give you a well-deserved break, does anyone want to ask Chris a question or two or make an observation, something that would help him to advance his work?
Hello, thank you for a great talk. It's very exciting. I was wondering, when you support this systemic change and help the community to flourish, how do you avoid that community gets gentrified, which would usually come after the community starts flourishing?
I don't have an answer for how we make sure they don't get gentrified. Because I think gentrification takes place in a lot of different forms. I think we typically think about it as a racial switch. But one of the things we're starting to see on the south side, so I stay in Washington Park, which is just south of Bronzeville. I'm not from that neighborhood. I'm from the southwest side. But I can now afford to be there when people who live there their whole lives probably can't. So market forces dictate where people go. So unless we start thinking about redesigning markets, I don't think we're going to prevent that. So some of the attempts have been affordable housing, so they'll say, or mixed income communities, where they'll delegate 10% of properties for low income, and then middle class, and then upper class. And so far, that's the best that we've got. So I think it's, again, on us to start thinking beyond what we know and think about what should be. Because those policies, those market forces do not work to end this racism and these other oppressions. So I talk a lot about racism, but I know like sexism is a huge one, and all these other, like there's lots of oppressions that are integral into these systems that make them the way that they are. And so I think we have to be intentional from the onset that we're going to start to address those and not just address symptoms of these systems. And I think if we do that, then we can start to figure out how to end gentrification.
So just a suggestion, anyone that wants to ask Chris a question, if you put your hand up, I'll spot you and I'll get you the mic ahead of time. We'll make it a little faster, sure. And while I'm passing the mic over, Chris, I've heard that the Obama Library is going to further challenge the economic fundamentals in the Bronzeville neighborhood. Have you heard that?
It already has. So the Obama Presidential Library has not even been built, but just the speculation that it will happen has raised property values, which then raises property taxes. And so people who have lived in this community for a long time can no longer afford those taxes and being pushed out. The area in which I live in is situated, the Obama Center is to the east of me, and then University of Chicago, one of their outposts is to the north. And so we're kind of being circled in by these growing property values and rents.
Okay, Chris, a question I have. What kind of stakeholders are you including in your project? Because I'm assuming it must be quite some of them in order to increase the chance that different levers can be pulled to create changes.
At the marketplace, we're really reliant upon who came. So we weren't doing targeted outreach to try to get, we weren't trying to ensure we didn't have a stakeholder map to figure out who should be at the table. Or in the process, we were allowing anyone from the neighborhood and people who weren't from the neighborhood to start to think about these things. One of the methods we used was we used a descriptive value web to try to get residents to start thinking broader about who are stakeholders who should come. Because we understood we didn't know exactly who should be there. And so if we could allow them to map it out and push their thinking, then they could start inviting. So they started talking about church folks and aldermen, things that we hadn't even considered.
Hey, Chris. You said a couple of things like finding the right point of intervention, and then you also said like having the confidence to create a solution that matters. Just interested to hear your thoughts a little bit more about how do you find the right point of intervention? You know, how is there a methodology around that, or is it more of a chance thing? Is it a gut feel thing, or is it a combination of all? What are your thoughts?
I think it's more of a point of view. So even the county project, so this was before I even went to any design schools or any of that. We were just doing participatory action research with young people, but the point of view that we had from the beginning was that the system is racist. We have to uncover it and then figure out a solution. And so I think we all intrinsically know that oppression exists, but I think we have to put it at the front of the work that is what we're trying to, one of the things that we're going to try to solve, and then we can get to more meaningful solutions.
Hey Chris, thanks for the talk, I really enjoyed it. I do a lot of work with smaller systems, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what I should be paying attention to in, I guess, a smaller scale to keep an eye out for oppressions and the kinds of things that you're working to resolve.
Can you give me an example of a small system?
A single business, I suppose.
I think it's the same. So, I mean, something that I live by is that we live in a racist system. It is. And if we have that point of view, then we start to look for ways in which we can understand how racism plays a factor in that system. So even in small business, right? If we look at wage gaps, we know that there's racism because black people don't make as much as white people or Latino people, and women don't make as much as men. So we know sexism exists in business practices. How do we identify it? That's on us to now do that work. And if we're not doing that work, then we're not, to me, not getting to the meaningful thing that leads to systems change. We're kind of like realigning.
Thank you for the talk. I mean, you kind of start with the historical context of these problems, and I think designers should be, we say that we are anthropologists, we are activists, but then kind of adding on new job as a historian. But having that historical understanding, does that help you to address this problem, or is that makes you more frustrated? Could you tell us about that link with your historical context with your problem solving?
Sure, I wish some of my students were here to talk about that, because the first 3 weeks of our class was all about history. And a lot of them kind of looked at me like, why are we talking about this? This is a design school, you're talking about history. So they were doing secondary research on a project focused on boys and young men of color in Chicago. And so I asked them, I said, is this historical research that we're doing, is it helpful for you to understand the current context? Because if it's not, then we'll stop. But they all said it was. Because there's nuances to everyone. And if we don't understand people's history, we can't begin to understand why things are happening. And not just around their personal nuances. If we're thinking at the systems level, what has been the historical treatment of a group of people if we're trying to design for, so then we can understand why the current context exists. So if you look at if we're just looking at data to understand data or just observational research, if we go into a black neighborhood now and we see single parenthood, then we make assumptions on why that exists. But then if you go into the history of policy, then you can start to see, or from slavery, the separation of families, then the reunification, and then housing policies that tore families apart again. To understand that then gives you a different understanding of those in which you're designing for, or hopefully with, to think about new systems.
Hi. So I wanted to know more about how you as a designer interact with the existing community organizations and efforts in Bronzeville, like the Greater Bronzeville Neighborhood Network and the Center for New Horizons and the Bronzeville Neighborhood Farm.
So a couple of those people, or people who work there, I've taught design to. And so the reason why I moved to this neighborhood was because I did a community design project, and it was all about empowering them to solve a challenge that they had identified. And so for me, I felt like I had to be closer to the actual problem so that I would actually care about it. Because it's very easy to try to do change from a safe bunker where it's nice. I don't live like next to, there's shootings in my neighborhood, but I felt like I had to be closest to what's going on to be able to be of service. And I think that was a mindset shift that I wasn't taught in design school. It wasn't, how do you serve with people? It was designed for. And so my background being a community organizer in the city for a long time, that was something that I wanted to bring to this. And so how do you have skin in the game? If you're going to design with folks, especially around social issues, they want to know, are you invested in this? And if it's just a project that you will put on the shelf at the end of the day, they're not going to engage with you in the way that you need as a designer, and they're not going to engage in a way with you so that you can help them. Because I do think that we have a set of understandings and tools and frameworks that are helpful to make change that needs to be made. But it's like tempering our arrogance. Design is not going to save the world, just in case people were thinking that. But we can be helpful in that process. And so I think design also helps people become more human, which again, to this race piece, we have to see, for me, my point of view is we have to see each other as humans first to then make this change. Because if we can do that, then we wouldn't do the things that we do to people day in and day out. And so how do you get really working with people? And so a lot of those folks are still friends. They come to my house for barbecues and being a part of that network.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions for you. So the first one is I absolutely agree with your perspective that we need to shift perceptions of black people in order to shift inequality. The question that would go along with that for me is who takes responsibility for inequality? And when just hearing you speaking, I guess the sense that I get is that people are already sort of marginalized and struggling, sort of granted less opportunity and therefore struggling to support their families. It almost adds an additional layer of disadvantage if they're suddenly kind of carrying the entire burden of sort of rewiring the system and its perceptions of black people. And so should that burden be carried by black communities? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, how do you feel black people are already sort of modifying their participation in the system as a result of racism?
So the answer to the first one is no. I don't think it's on any one group of people to carry the burden of any of these societal ills. Like I wouldn't say, is it on women to fix sexism? No. It is on us to acknowledge that something is not right and then figure out how we change it. I think we've all known this was a problem for a long time, and it always felt so big, we would say, well, it can't be fixed till like way later on. And then it just keeps being later on. Again, we're at the 400-year anniversary. We can't wait 400 years. So no, I don't think it's on black people to bear that cross. The second one, how have black people basically created workarounds to being left out? One of the examples in Bronzeville, so when black people came here, they created this thing called policy. So how could they create their own economy? So the evolution of policy is the lottery. So back in the day, you would run numbers, if anyone's ever heard that term. And so the numbers were the last 3 digits of the stock market, the stock exchange at the end of the day. And so people would bet on what those 3 numbers would be. It created a multi-million-dollar industry in Bronzeville, and then they came and smashed it, literally through police, through laws, and then the Italian mob took it over in Chicago. Then the state took it over by creating the lottery. In terms of like democratic processes, you can look at the Black Panthers. So like how can you govern your own community when, excuse me, the system has been set up against you? So they set up breakfast programs. That's why children in the United States actually get free lunch because they said, you're not going to feed our kids, we'll do it. When they had to deal with police brutality, they got guns and said, you're not going to kill us, we will police ourselves. So black Americans have modified the existing structures to work for us since we've gotten here. But it's not sustainable when you're working against a larger system. And so we can't just keep modifying, we have to be allowed into to then change.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question regarding methodology, and this is something that in the process of mapping futures with communities or trying to understand futures with communities, one of the things that we have noticed working on that is that there's I think that, I mean, designers will work with future, but it's a luxury involved in thinking about the future because it represents that you have an income enough to actually stop thinking about the present and start thinking about the future. Have you noticed that when working with communities that a shortened vision of a future, and if you have how do you address that with the community?
We ask people to go into 2075 and look back, so not a short period of time, a pretty long period of time. People engaged with us because we were working on an issue that actually mattered to them. That's what our understanding was. I think if we would have been talking about the future of the internet and asking people to pontificate and future frame, I don't think we would have been as successful because it's like, who gives a shit about the internet when I'm trying to like make sure my kid's school doesn't get closed down. But when the issue of, we put that, so this market, there's a train, I think I took this picture from the train track, or not the train track, the train station. It's a pretty busy area. And on this box, when we put that statement, the future of black folks has to be different than the present, people saw it from a block away and would come because it mattered to them. And that was a future they were interested in exploring. So I think we have to find the things that truly matter to folks, even, overly exploited communities, and they want to engage in that because it's still their future, it's still their children's future, and so yeah, not doing just things that we care about, but how do we put them in the process? Yeah.
Hi, I have a question around. So you mentioned your background is as a community organizer, and then you were saying. Speaking about design, I forget the word you said. I have written down something about designers can be arrogant. I don't know, that was not the word, but I'm really curious to hear as a community organizer who is now in the realm of design, what do you like about design? Like what has drawn you to it? And what is your critique of design as a field?
Sure. Yeah, I think I did say arrogant. I believe that. So you said what brought me to it? Oh, what drew me to it? I love the human-centeredness of it. I think we all need to have that outlook, that we are humans. And once we can start using that language and stop trying to identify each other by these small, what I think are small particularities that are divisive, once we can get on this unifying platform, then we can figure out more collective ways forward. I also like the interdisciplinary part of it. Part of the way I was raised was that we have to value other people's opinions because they can see things that we can't, which I think is ingrained into this discipline, or is what I want to ingrain into it. I think a critique is the flip of that. So if we look at the field, it is not representative of the population, and that's problematic as hell. I think it reinforces very colonial outlooks and practices and design. And so how are we going to bring in different points of view and allow, not just allow, but move out the way for them to create? I do think there's a problem with arrogance. Even when, like, the process of, like, researching someone means, like, I got some things that I'm going to take from you so then I can create something better for you. And so if we're not really getting people involved in the process, like, what we're doing is not rocket science. Other people can learn the same way we learn, other people can learn. So if we think it's as powerful as it is, then how are we more intentional about spreading it? So those are a couple.
Hi. So this goes back to the question of the effort to change perceptions. I have a Muslim identity, and recently I was sitting across someone and I heard something that he said, very well-educated, amazing person, kindest people, and I was shocked. It's like, where did you get this from? And it's almost like stories have the biology of a virus, and they grow, and then they mutate, and they get worse, and then our efforts to fight the virus, we create new stories, which are sometimes, even worse than that. So have you, so a lot of what we hear about, we've almost, if you live in the US or even worldwide, we've heard about these stories about racism, when did supremacy came, even that, the simulation, right? Have you thought about thinking like a biologist with regards to stories that create perceptions, maintain them? It's almost like it's not so much that people are bad, it's the stories that they're telling and the retelling that are terrible. They're almost like the herpes virus, right? Mm-hmm. You're born in a community, the stories are part of you, and you pass them on. So have you thought about using the power of narrative, especially, you can't change the entire story because then people won't recognize it, but have you thought of like just how biologists work on a virus, modify just a little bit of it? Have you thought of thinking along those terms? Yeah, so if we're talking, I think that gets back to how do we increase diversity in this field? If we're going to shift narratives, it can't just keep coming from the same people talking about somebody else. How do we empower them to tell their own stories? Then we can start to see the truth. So like these stereotypes are based on fictions and lies and lots of other things. And they're told by a certain group. If we look at media around the world, what's it like 5 companies control, or at least in the United States, it's like 3 or 5 companies control everything we hear, see, and like take in, right? So how are we empowering those who are not in those positions to tell different narratives? And how can design be used to do that? Which means like not us telling the story, but how do we get them to tell the story?
Thank you so much for your talk. One thing that became really apparent for me was how systems end up perpetuating some of intersectionality of problems. And I wonder if you found ways of creating empathy with stakeholders on how that intersectionality comes to life when you're trying to get buy-in.
Mm-hmm. So I don't focus too much on intersectionality, but working with the teens around the reform in the justice system, so half of them were court involved or had been in the system, and half of them had not. And so the empathy phase was most important for me. They had to see those kids who were incarcerated as themselves. Not about like boy, girl, sexual orientation, any of those things, but just how could they be me, which came through storytelling. The young people who were incarcerated just talked about what happened, and they would say, you know, I did a thing. Something we have all done, it was the chance that they got caught. That was the delineation. And so once they could understand that these weren't these false narratives, these weren't these wild criminals who, you know, will come and like break in your home and stab you in the night, they were kids, then they could say, okay, now I care about it enough to do something about it. Which again, to this thing around like a power of design, making people human, I think that's something that we have to really double down on. Because I think intersectionality actually pulls us more apart. As much as it was intended to say like we're complex and as a whole, I think in practice we've seen it pull people apart, especially in the activist circle in the United States. And so I think we have to get back to points of unity to then move forward.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it is nearly impossible to have a thoughtful conversation in this room between the human factors of the environment and the pathetic acoustics. It's made nearly, you know, impossible, and yet Chris managed to do so. Can we acknowledge, please, his thoughtfulness and generosity? No, I'm not getting away that easy. Thank you. In 1960, an extraordinary young man got a certificate suitable for framing from this environment, and then 5 years later was made a professor here. Charles L. Owen was the guy that taught systems thinking and specifically the methods to deal with complexity, such as the intersectionality of a whole bunch of pieces of a system. He became, through the years, really the heart of the ways that the Institute of Design was made substantive instead of surface-oriented. Under the extraordinary dean for 24 years, Jay Doblin, one of the things that Jay said, there's 2,000 design schools in the world, 1,997 of them worry about making things that are pretty. We're going to worry about making things that work. And nobody embodied that expectation and that spirit more beautifully, more ambitiously than Charles L. Owen, who later was chosen by this university, IIT, as a distinguished professor, a very rare and important honor. We're going to do a big tribute to him at the end of the day that will include a speech by one of his PhD students that will be remarkable, followed by a toast from the guy that inherited, however timidly, the role to teach his class after he stopped teaching structured planning. And we learned last night, of course, in a last-ditch effort to avoid a party in his honor, that Charles L. Owen passed away. Yeah, I know. So those of us that have been associated with the Institute of Design for a long time have lost a friend and lost a guy at the heart of the school. But one thing we do have is his book on how to do structured planning and advanced planning, how to really deal with complexity and how to really deal with systems thinking. And it is my honor to give you, Chris, a copy of Chuck's book. With the thanks of all of the organizers for everything you did to give us a chance to learn from you today, sir. Thank you very much. And again, my guess is we pushed your ischial tuberosities about as far as anybody should have them pushed. So please take a good, well-deserved break. We'll start again with Saskia at 11, okay? So please come back ready to learn some more. Thank you very much.